Welcome to the AirCon Vault, recordings of the live streams from Airwiggle's audio conference. These are made free thanks to our sponsors, A Sound Effect, Game Audio Learning, Kilo Hearts, Audio Kinetic, Sound Cuts, Sugi, Boom Library, Sound Warriors, and Airwiggles, the online home for audio people.
Let's boot up the mothership here. The name of this talk is Making a Living in Audio in Uncertain Times. This week has just been an incredible week of great talks, advice, information. I mean, the talent in the room is just bonkers. It's really an honor to be here to be able to talk to you about things. This is likely the elephant in the room. We're all looking to either get started in sound, doing something that we love, or we are currently working in sound and we want to stay there. You know, we've just had a traumatic event and now you're not working in sound. And so what I thought I would do is share the journey that I've had because I've been doing this for quite a long time, as you're going to find out. And I've been through all of this before, and it didn't always go well. So I want to talk to you about how I managed to survive all these years and manage all these ups and downs in the industry. So basically, the idea is to use my experience in now what is coming up on 4 decades. I mean, the exact start date is a little vague for me, but we're probably within 6 months of 4 decades of working professionally in sound. We'll discuss some thoughts about how to get started, the value of education, and most importantly, what to focus on once you get the job to stay gainfully employed over the course of a lifetime. These are very trying times in really all the audio related industries. So games, film and television, sound, and I'll be speaking to how the past or what's happened in the past can help inform what's happening now and perhaps how we can manage it and what are best practices for what to do as we go forward. I want to take a little bit of the mystery out of the process of what it means to be making a living over a course of a lifetime. Those of us who have been doing it this long, we don't have some unusual DNA that makes us special. I've really sort of cobbled together a career, and you can too. So let's talk about what this isn't about. I can't get you a job, unfortunately. I can't tell you where to get a job. I can't tell you exactly how to get a job. And I also can't tell you when things are going to get better. I don't have the answers. So if you are coming here for any of these, I won't be insulted if you drop off now and grab a cup of coffee, and then we'll see you back at the awards coming up in an hour and a half. But if you stay, I've got some good stories to tell, and I think some good pointers to share. So having said all that, let's kind of take stock of where things are at. We are in now this post-COVID world, and I think all of us thought it would only get better post-COVID, but that's not quite what's happened. So we now seen widespread layoffs in video games. There were two big strikes in the US, and recovery has been very, very slow coming back. And a lot of people are hurting, and it's very worrying. The UK, you've had a decline in funding for television. And then to add insult to injury, we have this threat of AI. I mean, this just came like a lightning bolt out of nowhere, it seems. And, you know, what is this going to mean for you and for me and for all of us? So, who am I? Why should you care and be here to listen to me? You may know me already if you participated in the sound design showdown here. My team, Three Wise Men, with Paul Shelley and Jake Cargill, were the submission of the showdown winners for our sushi making montage. So that's one place where you might have heard of me. Or you might have heard my interview on Akash Thakar's Sound Business show. And that was a real great honor to be interviewed by him. And that was in April 2023 that was launched. So, what's my background? I am an award-winning sound designer, re-recording mixer, and mastering engineer. I've had 4 decades in film, television, music, and advertising industries. I've been teaching part-time for 2 decades, once a week. I teach at Montclair State University in New Jersey. I have been a contributor to Sound on Sound and Resolution magazines in the UK. And I'm also a WISE certified instructor. Let me just talk about my formal education. I have a bachelor's of professional studies in interdisciplinary music studies. That's a mouthful. That's from the Berklee College of Music. I started on campus at the very beginning of my journey, and I finished it online with Berklee Online much later in life. And I also have a Master of Fine Arts in Video Game Music and Audio through ThinkSpace Education and the University of Chichester in the UK. And I'll be speaking a little more about why and how later with that. My work experience. So here's my 40 years of work. I started out at the top audio post production facility in New York City. It was called Howard Schwartz Recording at the time. It was later renamed to HSR New York. It's not there anymore. And I'll be talking about that a little more. Then I went to RCA Studios in New York, which had just been acquired by Bertelsmann Music Group, and they changed the name of the studios. But for me, it's always RCA Studios. For reasons which we will go into, I established my own company. It's called Digital Sound and Picture Inc. I've worked for Broadway Sound. They were part of Broadway Video in New York City in the famous Brill Building, and I did a lot of work with them. Major League Baseball, they have a facility in Secaucus, New Jersey. I'm a huge baseball fan. I'm going to talk about how I got into that job a little bit later and what I had to do to make that happen. The Sandblast Productions are just wonderful people that I have been involved with for pretty much my entire career. And they are just a wonderful audio production company in New York City. And I do a lot of work with them. And through them, many of my other opportunities have come along, and specifically Showtime Network. I have a very, very long time relationship with Showtime, starting initially writing music for trailers and sports programs, and then becoming a full-time contract mixer for them and doing tons and tons of trailers, which I'll talk about soon. And now Paramount Plus, we have a consolidation and merging within the streaming television space, and that's where I'm currently working. I want to talk a little bit about some of the mastering and audio restoration work that I've done, the awards. When I was at RCA, I got to work on, it was a 3-year project, and I did about 52 CDs of classical music, which was conducted by Arturo Toscanini with the NBC Symphony Orchestra. Toscanini is probably the greatest conductor of all time, and I really didn't know anything about classical music or certainly opera. I grew up on rock and roll, and I was into prog rock, and I was into jazz. And I really got this incredible education being able to work on this music. And we had 2 Grammy nominations in the same category in one year. We didn't win, but it was very early on to have something like that to hang my hat on. A little bit later, Frank Sinatra recordings with Tommy Dorsey. It was a box set called "The Song Is You" that was also Grammy nominated. For that one, I was lucky enough to have been flown out to the Grammys by the record company and go to the amazing after party, which was more exciting than the ceremony itself. Again, we didn't win, but it was great to be nominated. And one project that I did work on that did win a Grammy, I did not get a credit. And I have a lot of work that I've done in the course of my career that I have been uncredited for. There's been ghost work and a lot of NDA things. So part of that mastering work and restoration was probably about a little more than 400 CDs of records by Sam Cooke, Elvis, Jefferson Airplane, Lou Reed, film soundtracks, Sound of Music, Muppet Christmas Carol. That was great because they were recording the soundtrack literally down the hall from me, and then they would bring the finished mixes in to be mastered. And finally, Hair, which was another favorite from that time. Some of the television trailer work and awards that I've gotten. I literally have dozens, but just simplifying them here. The first three up there are for original score for some trailers, and then best trailer awards were generally team awards, so they weren't specifically to me directly. The most recent one being the Yellow Jacket season 2 trailer, which won the best television series trailer from the drama category at the Clio Awards. So let's talk about how to get started. Because I know there's a lot of you out there that are looking to get into the industry. And before I hit the next slide, what I do want to say is that all those jobs that I showed you that I've done in my career, including the education experience, which wasn't listed there, I got through word of mouth. I have never submitted a resume for a job that I have. It's all been based on this networking. And you've heard it, I'm sure, a million times. People say this over and over again. I'm not really telling you anything you don't know, but networking is certainly really important. And it's been the cornerstone of my career, everything. So, what people recommend today is to go to meetups, go to conventions, Game Sound Con, Game Developers Conference, the Audio Engineering Convention. I go to all of those. Post online. Most of you do. Be visible. Most of you are. Let me tell you how I did it, how I got my first job. I went to a party, and I'm not a big party person. I have tend to be drag kicking and screaming to parties. I went to a party with my girlfriend. It was her cousin's party, and I met somebody at that party who he was working in an audio post studio, and he said he could recommend me for a job there. And so the following week, I went for an interview, and this is what they said to me: "There's no hope for advancement." And that's not exactly the kind of words you want to hear when you're showing up for a job. All they wanted me to do was to make the coffee, empty the trash, put out the bagels in the studio, and deliver the packages around New York City. They're a little stingy. They didn't even want to give you any money for transport. So the only reason why I took this job is that the guy who recommended it to me, the guy that I met at this party, he went down the same path. And when I met him, he was producing a cartoon at the time called Thundercats. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I did it for 2 months, and I was just about to quit, and somebody got fired up the food chain. And so I advanced. And so for 6 months, I worked in what we called the dub room or the duplication room. And that's where you made tape copies. When the Thundercats, the way that that went down is that all the audio was mixed and produced beforehand. And then we would do a transfer to 35 millimeter mag tape. And then that would get shipped to Japan for them to animate. I learned how to edit with analog tape and razor blades. And I think most importantly about this very formative time was that I was mentored by a Ukrainian audio engineer who taught me how to listen. And I really owe so much to this person. And I have no idea where he is today or if he's even still alive. But Yashra, thank you. Then I graduated to an assistant engineer position, and that lasted for 2 years. And I want you to consider this time frame here because I know that today people think in very different time spaces. You go out and you get your headphones and you get, let's say, Reaper, and you start sound redesigning, and time scales are very compressed, and there's an expectation that you're going to move on from one role to the next role to the next very quickly. And in many cases, people do. But back when I get started, that was not the case. I mean, you really had to pay your dues. And it really helped form the foundation of who I am as an audio person. So I got to work on these very high end, very high stress ad agency jingles. These are commercials, and the jingle is a music that's written for a commercial, usually with lyrics for products like McDonald's, Budweiser, Dr. Pepper, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I spent hundreds of hours sitting behind some of the best mixing engineers in New York City. That was such an invaluable experience, and it's something that is really not available to most people today. So I was consider myself very lucky. I did sound design in front of clients with a DX7, and I have to tell you, that was really, really hard. If any of you know what the DX7 is, if you've seen sort of like the Arturia recreation of it, I think it was a single, maybe it had 2 lines of LCD display. It was really cryptic. I was used to analog synthesizers with knobs and faders, and the DX7, I would guess, I mean, I would press buttons and wiggle the one fader that they have on it, and, it was very hard to actually respond specifically to requests from a client. So trial by fire. It's very cool also getting to be exposed to the first generation of drum machines that you'd have to set up for the sessions, the original Linn drums and the EMU SP1200 and the Akai S900 sampler. Samplers were digital synthesis and samplers were the new rage at this time. Those were a lot of fun to work with. And as assistant engineer, I got to do the sound design and theme music for a show on MTV called Dial MTV. That was really great. I recorded a lot of voiceovers, and those were done over satellite. It was hugely expensive and very stressful because you'd be in a room with advertising agency executives. Sometimes there'd be like 6 or 7 of them, and you record the voiceover, and then you have to edit it to time. And when you're trying to take the breaths with analog tape, you have to fill it with tone, but you have to put the breath on the side of the tape machine. Take a little piece of tape and put the breath on the side, and sometimes you'd have to put the breath back and you go for the tape, but then the tape fell on the floor and you'd be scrambling and people would be looking at you and just being very impatient. It was not fun. I got to write music for some American Express radio commercials at the time, and I got my first album credits by working with some Pat Metheny bandmates, Mark Egan and Dan Gottlieb. So just an absolutely wonderful experience. Here's a picture of me in the studio at that time. This would have been on the weekend when I brought my own gear in to work on my music. I was told at the time that that was one of the first SSL series consoles in New York City. It had something called Total Recall. And what Total Recall was, it would remember your EQ settings and dynamics and aux sends, but you literally had to, you would have a screen that would show what the settings are for each channel strip. And you would have to turn every single knob on each channel strip until it matched the position that the computer had recorded. And it took a solid hour to recall a session before you could start mixing. It was really crazy compared to what we have now, which is instant recall of just about everything. I would generally work about 60 hours a week at this job and then go in on the weekends to work on my own projects. And so, what you can sort of see at the very bottom of the picture on the bottom right there is just a very snippet of a Roland D50 keyboard, which had just been released. In front of me is an EMU Emax sampler. And I'm looking down at the Mac SE, which had 2 floppy drives. And I had a hard drive next to it. It was 30 megabytes. 30 megabytes, and it was about $750. We're gonna talk about the cost, comparisons, from then till now in a second. Try to imagine this with today, when you're working at home, you've got everything in front of you and everything is automated and easy, and we had MIDI at home, but we couldn't record audio into a computer, so off screen there is a 24-track analog tape machine, and what I would do is I would transfer my MIDI tracks to the 24-track tape machine, and then I would rewind it when I wanted to go into the studio to play guitar or piano. They had a beautiful Steinway piano in this studio. I would have to rewind the tape, put it into record, run out of the control room into the studio, put my headphones on, start to play, finish, run back into the control room, stop the tape, rewind the tape. If you made a mistake, it just went on and on and on like that. You did whatever it took to get the job done, and in those days, that's what it took. So it was great fun. It was a great learning experience. So the takeaway from this very first job From that one networking event that I went to, that one party, I made connections that have lasted my entire career. I still work with or for those people that I met at that very first job. There really is no greater networking opportunity than in person. And, who knew, just going to a family party, you never know who you're going to meet when you get out there. So always keep an open mind and consider what does networking mean. And in that case, it wasn't a convention or some audio meetup. It was just a normal family party. So always keep that in mind. Next. This is the next great words that were spoken to me. So to set this up, sometimes you need to make sacrifices. And if an opportunity presents itself, you need to seize the moment because it may not happen again. When you get that call, and in this case, I got that call. I was on vacation with my girlfriend, and a friend who I'd met at the first job was working at RCA Studios. And he called me and he said that he could get me an interview at RCA for an engineering job the next day. And I said, "Oh boy, I'm on vacation and my girlfriend's birthday was the next day." It's like, geez, I really need to be here for her birthday. And, it's a 4-hour drive back. And he said these words to me: "How bad do you want the job?" So the next morning at 6 o'clock, I got in the car and I drove 4 hours to New York City and I went to the interview and they asked me a bunch of questions and they said, "Okay, give us a shout at the end of the day. We'll let you know." So I went home and I waited and waited and waited. And at 6 o'clock, I called and they had all left. They went to a retirement party. And so I was like, okay, I got back in the car. I drove back to the vacation spot. I got there about 10 o'clock. So it totally ruined my girlfriend's birthday. And that was, I think, a Tuesday. On Friday of that week, I checked my voice messages and I had gotten a call from the human resources department telling me to report the following Tuesday to fill out forms. So no one had actually even offered me the job. It was just so amazing. But I made that sacrifice and I got that job. And that job was at RCA Studios. And I worked there for 5 years. So this was such an incredible experience. I got to work with so many incredible people. Sean Murphy, who is probably, the greatest film scoring mixer of all time. John Kurlander, I spent a week working with him. At the time, he was the chief engineer at Abbey Road Studios. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he had worked with the Beatles, and I grew up a huge Beatle fan. And he was the assistant engineer on the Beatles' last album, Abbey Road. If I had only known that at the time, I would have been talking to him about it all week long and probably driving him crazy. I got to record Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear soundtrack with Sean and Vince Caro. Vince is an amazing engineer that I started with at RCA, and he's been at Pixar forever, and he records all the dialogues for all of the Pixar's animated films. I learned how to record full orchestra and big bands in very big studios. I'm going to show you a diagram and a picture in a second. I got to work with almost all of my jazz heroes there. Keith Jarrett, Don McLaughlin, Metheny, Wynton Marsalis, George Shearing, Gary Burton, John Schofield. It was just so, so wonderful. Composers Elmer Bernstein. He was conducting the Cape Fear soundtrack. He wrote the music for Magnificent Seven. I grew up watching reruns of that movie on TV. John Barry, he wrote the music for first James Bond film, Dr. No. He was there for a demo. It was a full orchestra the entire day just for a demo recording. It's crazy. He didn't get the gig either. Producer Orrin Keepnews, a big jazz fan, as I've said, and I would buy records by artists that I didn't know who they were, but if I saw his name on it, I would buy it. And to be in a situation then where I got to work with him it was just so humbling. This was also when I was introduced to the art of mastering and audio restoration. And this was when the first Cedar system showed up in the United States. I believe RCA was the first to take delivery of it. And I'm going to talk about the Cedar a little bit more. But if you think about Isotope RX, sort of this is where that all came from. And it was uh, hardware based, and it was expensive. Here's a picture of one of these studios at RCA. I believe this is actually Studio C. They all looked relatively similar. The diagram for Studio A is on the right there. There were 6 studios at RCA, and Studio A was 6,000 square feet. It was 3 stories high. The ceiling could come up and down, the walls could come in and out. It was just an unbelievable opportunity to learn how to set up microphones in those times. This was what the mastering rooms looked like. On the left-hand side there, this is the Sony 3000 editor. We didn't have direct-to-disc recording. You recorded on 3/4 inch videotape, and that's what these machines are here. And in the center console, this is the Harmonia Mundi EQ and compressor, and this was really the most prized state-of-the-art mastering EQ in the day. So RCA was a union job, and you would think, "Ah, great, job security." Well, the lease on the studio was expiring, and the recording studio was gonna be shut down. And, the way that the unions work, or at least this particular union, was that they prioritized seniority. So, last in, first out. I was laid off from this job. I was 3 people away from the cutoff point. I was actually a union shop steward, and I helped negotiate the contract that would lay me off. It was very surreal. So the takeaways from that, a union job is not a guarantee. In general, unions negotiate the terms of your employment and the terms of your unemployment. They don't get you jobs, and they don't necessarily prevent you from being laid off. I also learned that nothing lasts forever. It was very hard to learn that lesson, and I was not prepared for it. So now what? So I approached all the top mastering facilities in New York City looking for a job. Master Disc was one of them. I approached the power station, and the offer that they made to me was if I would pay for the construction, pay for the gear, and bring in the clients, that then they would take me in and pay me a salary. And I thought, no, thank you. This is in 1993, so I started to work remotely at home doing mastering and restoration. So I set up a business and I got an accountant. The first digital workstation I used was called Sonic Solutions. It cost $35,000. And I did one of those conversions on Google, and it almost made me cry. It's $75,000 in today's dollars. The Cedar system, which was a DOS-based computer, so I had Sonic Solutions was on the Mac, and Cedar was on a PC. That was 6 figures. And to give you a sense of how much stuff costs, some of my students moan and groan about just even spending $100 for a pair of headphones these days. A CD recorder, the Sony's CD recorder that you would use to burn CDs to as gold master that you would send to a plant, was $10,000. I still have it in another room here. I can't throw it away. I haven't used it in decades, but I just can't throw it out. A 6 gigabyte array, $4,000. So in 1993, that cost in today's dollars is about 400,000. So I got really depressed when I started putting those numbers together. It was very, very expensive. Okay. So I formed my own company, Digital Sound and Picture Inc. And for 7 years, I did mastering and restoration. So more Elvis, Sinatra, Lou Reed, Jefferson Airplane, John Denver. I mentioned Heifetz, the Sound of Music. And I was also working on independent films on the East Coast, music, sound design, and mixing. And I did a lot of writing for television, animated children's specials such as Sesame Street, Christmas Carol, Peppermint Rose. I wrote music for Showtime Championship Boxing and a lot of trailers for Showtime Network. I bought a lot of synthesizers during this period too. You can see here in the picture at the top left, it's an Oberheim SEM. Next to it is an ARP 2600. I actually had 2 of those at one point. It's a Prophet T8 keyboard, lots of samplers, Mini Moog, Korg Trinity workstation, and off to the side, what you can't see is an Oberheim 4 voice and a OB8. So I bought so many synthesizers and I couldn't fit them all on this list. There were many, many more. Eventually, to survive, I had to sell all these, but I'll get to that later. So I was doing this for 7 years, and there was a problem. I was getting so much work from this one client that it was making up 90 to 95% of my business. 85% of it was all from the same record company. And because I was so busy, it didn't allow for time to develop other clients or work in other areas of audio. And even though I was running my own business, that's no guarantee of job security. So there was an uh-oh moment that came along. Something called Napster. People started to share music online. Illegal MP3 downloads were rampant, and people just stopped paying for music. And the kinds of things that I would hear from people when I would plead with them not to do it, if I can download it for free, it must be okay, right? Or I wouldn't pay for it anyway. So people were just sort of self-justifying what was really illegal, a copyright violation. And that really had a profound effect on the record industry and my job. So who knew that this music industry business model that existed for a century virtually collapsed? Everyone that I knew in the record industry in the 1990s had lost their job by 2000. And once my direct client lost his job, that income evaporated. And for me, that was almost the equivalent of getting fired. To add insult to injury, the stock market crashed at that time. It was called the dot-com bubble. And it was just terrible, terrible timing. So takeaways, learning from my mistakes. I still wasn't prepared for this. And we saw it coming, and I didn't know what to do until after I got through it. So from that, I've learned that if you are a freelancer, don't tie yourself to one client or one specific line of work. Meaning, let's say you're just doing restoration, don't just tie yourself to restoration. If you're just doing sound design for video games, don't just tie yourself to that. You need to diversify into different sectors of audio. The more that you diversify, the more you start to insulate yourself against something going horribly wrong. Don't fall in love with what you do. That's really important. You need to be very, very open to other opportunities. And the reason for that is that the technology changes, industries shift, and unforeseen economic forces out of your control can render it obsolete. And, we're very much experiencing that now. This is also really important for all those who are working or who are very experienced. If you have a job, you need to be thinking now about what you can do if that goes away. Don't wait for it to happen. And I think it's when you have a job, when you have an employer, it's much, much harder to be thinking about this and preparing than it is if you're in a freelance frame of mind. It's almost paralyzing. So you really do need to consider your options now. Don't wait for it to happen. And don't buy too many synthesizers or plugins. I'm going to talk about the plugins shortly. I've done both, and it gave me short-term satisfaction, but it didn't last long. Okay, so what I did for the next 25 plus years, this was how I diversified. I got back into audio post mixing and sound design. I wrote for 2 different magazines. I'm not writing for them anymore, and one of them has recently closed. Education, I teach sound at the undergraduate level, and that has really been very, very rewarding. Teaching is a huge responsibility, and I don't recommend it lightly. It's very important the role that you play, and it will be very challenging because you really are responsible for your students and what they learn and how they learn. When I first went to school, it was sort of my tough luck if I didn't get it when they explained it to me. And I don't approach teaching that way. I find that if somebody doesn't understand what I've just told them, it's my responsibility to find a different way to explain it. So the value of that is that many things that we do in sound intuitively, almost without thinking about it, you have to really get under the skin of that process and you learn more about what it is that you actually do. And I think it makes you better at it. I continue to do composing for film and television, although not that much, and opportunities have just dramatically declined over the course of those 25 years as stock music became prevalent to the point where most clients were licensing pop songs or they would just grab a piece of stock music almost for free and that they didn't really spend much money on the people who lived in the middle. And I also continued for a time to do mastering and audio restoration for small independent record labels. So that's how I diversified. So thoughts about getting started, just kind of put a bunch of them together. Network in person whenever possible. Formal education. It's really a fabulous place to network. It will develop your foundational skills. You will begin to assemble a portfolio and it really helps build confidence. So I really highly recommend it. A non-formal education tends to be more focused on skills development, and those also help you assemble a portfolio and build your confidence. So those are also worth investing in. And certainly, if you have a formal education, there's always more to learn. When you're getting out of school or when you're starting out, you really need to be prepared to work freelance. There are fewer and fewer in-house jobs available. So you need to get in a different mindset. And to that extent, you need to think of what you do as a business, not so much a job, not so much a passion. Once you start thinking about it as a business, it will be a lot easier to make hard choices that are going to come your way because you'll make them with a very business sensibility. You may pick up a type of audio work that maybe it's not really what you want to do, but if it's going to cover your nut for that month, then you take it. Be flexible with the opportunities outside of your specific area of interest. This is just so important. So, if you want to do games and you're not finding opportunities, but you have an opportunity to, let's say, work on podcasts or an independent film, you should pursue those opportunities. Ultimately, who we are is the result of the opportunities that were available to us. So keep an open mind and always be looking out for something where you can utilize your core audio skill sets. What I tell my students is that the hardest part is not getting the job as impossible as it seems. And I apologize for all of you, those of you who are looking for a job right now, trying to get your first job. That's not really the hardest part. The hardest part is staying gainfully employed over the course of a lifetime doing what you do. Which leads me to once you get the job, how do you keep it? So, my advice is that always do the best you are capable of on everything regardless of how much you're getting paid, regardless of the stature of the job. I treat the sort of lowliest or lowest paying job or least important in the grand scheme of things in the universe. I put just as much effort and skill and attention into that as the highest paying job. Everything that you do is representative of who you are and what you can do. So people they remember you by virtue of the quality of work that you've done for them. And you never want to deliver subpar work because they'll always remember that more than they'll remember the good stuff. If you're freelancing, I recommend that you flat rate the job and then put as much time as you possibly can into it. Do not look at what the hourly rate is coming out to. Just make it as good as possible to make your client happy. In the course of that, if some unplanned extras are needed, unless it gets out of hand, I just take care of it. So, for instance, let's say I'm mixing a film, And then it turns out that we need some extra Foley. Most of the time, what I'll do is I'll just take care of that, and I won't go back to the client and, nickel and dime for every little extra thing that I do. Don't let yourself be taken advantage of, but, you wanna build goodwill with the client. They will love you for it and be very appreciative, and they're more likely to come back to you when you take care of it for them. Usually by the time people get to sound, they've run out of money, so, they usually don't have more money for you. Bring added value to what you do. Find something special that you can bring to the table that helps differentiate you from other people that do similar things that you do. And for me, the added value that I bring is because I'm a musician and I compose to my sound design and mixing work, I bring a real musical sensibility and a compositional sensibility. I often do a lot of what is called music overlays in trailer work that I do. A lot of times, the way trailers are cut, the music track doesn't always quite do what the client needs the music to do. So many times, I'll often compose music on top of the music that's already there to just hit a home run for the client. And that's something that really keeps the clients coming back to work with me, and they really value what I bring to the table in that department. So find for you something that's special. Best practices for everyone. Always be looking 5 years down the road. This is very hard when you're working for an employer, when you have a, let's say, a studio job. Keep an eye open for what could happen. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you potentially see your industry in 5 years? You must be thinking about this all the time. Also, develop a creative outlet on the side. So, something that you don't try to make a living with, something where people aren't giving you notes over. For me, that's photography. I do a lot of street photography. It's something that, sort of enriches my soul and gives me a lot of great satisfaction, and it's something that is just 100% mine. So find what that is, and if you're a sound designer, it might be just playing in a band without having to worry about trying to pay your bills with that music work. This creative outlet that I do, and maybe a few it's artwork, but don't look to it to pay your bills. Keep that separate. Always looking for, related jobs that utilize your core audio skill set. What I will say to that, though, is that, you can't necessarily jump from one thing into another without some degree of preparation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Learn something new. Learn how to use a new DAW. In this case, I mentioned Fairlight, and to go back to an employment opportunity that I mentioned earlier, working for Major League Baseball, I mixed in Pro Tools, and this opportunity come up to mix with Fairlight. And this goes back to before Fairlight got bought by DaVinci and incorporated into Resolve, or Blackmagic is the company. So Fairlight is very used to be very tied to hardware, and the keyboard was very unlike a standard QWERTY keyboard. It changed function based on whether you're in record mode or mix mode or edit mode, and it was very scroll wheel based rather than mouse based. So I didn't know how to use it, but I wanted this job. So I asked them for permission. And what I did was I went into the studio at night for a week and I basically taught myself how to use it. They weren't paying me to do that, but I made that investment in that knowledge. So whether it's picking up a new DAW, learning how to use a plugin, learning how to do field recording well, anything, but learn something new. There is always something new that you can learn. Please read books. Don't spend all your time online. There's lots of really, really good audio texts out there that are very carefully thought through and researched. A lot of knowledge that you can tap into. Network in person whenever possible. I keep going back to this, but I really can't say it enough. Pivot when necessary. So that means if your job opportunity in one field is drying up, you must look at another field. Don't be paralyzed by the lack of opportunity in the area that you really want to work in. So if you can't find any more podcasting work, take a look at game sound. If you can't find any game sound work, take a look at film sound. But keep an eye on pivoting. You're using the same fundamental skills. Don't be paralyzed. Don't let yourself be unemployed if you can help it. Oh boy, the 10,000-hour rule. So this is what I was referring to a little bit earlier. So this idea is that success equals 10,000 hours of preparation and one moment of opportunity. You need to be ready when it happens. So don't presume that if you are a sound designer, that you can just mix, film the next day. Yes, you can do it, but can you do it well? Can you do it with experience and insight? So don't wait for these opportunities to come along before you start trying to figure out how you could do those opportunities. Start investing way in advance about how to approach that. And I'm going to tell you how I did that. Don't spend all your money on software and plugins. I say this over and over and over. And I think most importantly, if I have one investment recommendation for your money, is invest in speakers, good pair of speakers. Okay, let's talk about the value of education. You don't know everything and you never will. I don't know everything. There is always something else to learn. Education opens your eyes to new possibilities. I find it really invigorating. It's necessary with the new technologies being introduced. Over the last 4 or 5 months, I've finally got my studio here set up with Dolby Atmos, and I'm been going down the path of I hadn't mixed in Dolby Atmos before, and now I'm doing everything I can to be as prepared as possible for an Atmos type gig. Formal education, which we've talked about, it provides structure and qualification. So it's worth the investment. Part of that investment is that it gets you exposure to tutor feedback, and that can really be invaluable, especially given that we don't have these sort of assistant engineer opportunities where you get to sit behind a master engineer for hundreds of hours and learning the ropes. So getting feedback from tutors can't be underestimated today. And knowledge is power. It really is, and it will give you such confidence to proceed. So, what's my 5-year plan? Let me tell you what I did. At the beginning of the pandemic, things were very frightening, and I wasn't sure if the work that I did in television was going to last, with productions being shut down all over the place. And I had 3 hours a day of free time from not commuting. I was still working from home, but I had that extra 3 hours. So I put in place a possible pivot. And what I wanted to potentially pivot to, I had taken some classes in game audio and music with Gina Zadanowitz and Michael Sweet at Berkeley Online. And that's where I was introduced to Wise and interactive audio. And I just was mesmerized by it. So to that end, I went online and while working through the pandemic full time, over 2 years, I got a Master in Fine Arts in video game music and audio. And that was with ThinkSpace Education in the UK. And that was just absolutely wonderful. I also got my WISE certified instructor credentials. I didn't want to just know how to use WISE, which I got from the basic certifications. I wanted to be able to teach it because I find that in order to teach something, you really, really need to know how things work. So that's why I did that. And I've been using that in my video game sound design class that I teach at Montclair State. I also did some additional studies at the School of Video Game Audio in Unreal Engine, and that's a sort of a non-formal education opportunity. But this was my 5-year plan. So this is now a little more than 4 years into it. I'm not working in game audio yet, but I've put more than 4 years of effort and study and research into a potential pivot. So these can take some time, and you need to allocate for it. So let's start to bring this to a close. Where are we at now? Some final thoughts. Yogi Berra is a baseball player, and he was a catcher for the New York Yankees, and he was famous for having all these quirky sayings, and, one of them was, "It's deja vu all over again," and I gotta tell you, having been through the record industry collapse, I'm feeling the same thing all over again. The entertainment industries are absolutely in flux. Layoffs are everywhere, but people are still working, and people are still getting hired. Every day on LinkedIn, I see somebody, I'm starting a new position at such and such a place. So it's not the end of days. Any of these industries, for them to survive, they must generate content. They just can't keep cutting back and not producing stuff, or they'll all go out of business. So it will change. But just as the music industry had to reinvent itself, I think these other industries will need to do that similarly. And as the pendulum swings in the other direction, I think we're likely going to end up with fewer games, fewer shows, fewer films, and as a result of that, potentially fewer jobs. So that's why it's really important to implement those best practices that I was talking about. You need to be the ideal candidate for somebody to latch onto. And then once you get that job, to hang on to it. And then the role of AI, it's uncertain. It's definitely going to affect some people, and it's already has affected some people. But copyright may ultimately be the backstop, to be determined. We'll see. It will certainly be ironic if that once people were looking the other way when it came to copyright, when it was convenient to just download songs that they didn't want to pay for, now, copyright may be our salvation. We'll have to see. I really don't know. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm worried much about it as you are, but I'm also hopeful that real talent and real skill is still going to be very much in demand. There's a fabulous guide that you can get at the Sound Effect website if you don't already know about it, and that's got lots of great expert advice that I highly recommend. So please pop over there and take a look. Just finally, some thank yous. I want to do a quick shout out to Steve Shapiro for helping me put together the proposal that I pitched this talk to Air Wiggles. And of course, to Lewis and Greg for creating the Air Wiggles community space and putting together AirCon and allowing me to be a part of it. I'd love to hear from you. Please contact me. You can find me here on Air Wiggles on LinkedIn, Bill Lacey. I am accessible on Twitter. I don't spend much time on it, but Pro Tools Mixer is my handle, and same on Instagram. The only social media I really spend much time on is LinkedIn. So, with that, I'm going to end the slideshow, and much success to you all. Bye bye.